do you view the significance of these protests in Russia over Putin's mobilisation plans?
I think you've hit the nail on the head already with your question. In some quarters, these are being interpreted as anti-war protests, which they're not really. You know, they are expressly anti-mobilisation protests. Now, that's not to say that they're not significant, because I think whenever anything pushes Russian citizens onto the streets, despite the significant dangers of going onto the streets, it is a big deal. But nonetheless, we probably shouldn't assume that this means something greater than it does. You know, the majority of Russian people are essentially pretty ambivalent about the war if they can carry on ignoring it. It's just that now it looks it's going to be pretty difficult for a lot of people to ignore it now these mobilisation plans have been announced.
Indeed. We're hearing reports tonight that some protesters who have been arrested and are in lockup are being drafted into this conscription, into this call-up from lockup. That would just be extraordinary, wouldn't it?
It seems extraordinary, but it very clearly fits in with the kind of techniques that the Russian regime often uses to suppress dissent. So it's not just making it difficult to go and protest, but it's showing that there's an explicit danger associated with protesting. And that's the idea of that, is that word of mouth will spread. People will be less likely to go onto the streets. I think that's the rationale behind that.
Yeah. The Duma has also adopted a law which is imposing penalties for looting, refusing to fight, surrender and desertion. Now, that would seem to be indicative that they are already facing some resistance from troops, would it not?
I think even before this mobilisation call was announced, there were really clear problems with morale amongst the Russian troops. That's partly because the entire military adventure was missold to them, so they didn't really realise, I think, what they were going to be doing. We have ample evidence from intercepted phone calls from soldiers to their relatives back home, for example, that backs that up. But then on a purely practical level as well, you know, a lot of these soldiers and even the elite officer corps hasn't actually received the kind of just basic equipment that they need. You know, we've heard stories of people having to go out and buy their own boots, for example. It really is extraordinary. So it's not a surprise at all that morale is so low amongst the Russian military.
What does it then tell you about Vladimir Putin's ability to really bolster his boots on the ground with this, you know, this new call-up?
So there are a few aspects to this. Now, the actual decree that was published about this mobilisation doesn't anywhere state that it's partial mobilisation, which was how Putin sold it in his address to the Russian people. Actually, the wording of the decree doesn't say that, and it's deliberately very ambiguous, so that although he talked about people with previous military experience being drafted up, theoretically, pretty much anyone could eventually be called up. And so you can see that there's a kind of attempt to leave a lot of options open there. And part of the reason for this is that I think that the Russian leadership is kind of grappling with this as they go along. They were not expecting the ferocious counteroffensive that they've just had to deal with. And they're essentially, I think, in a position where they know it's going to be very difficult to secure any sort of convincing win in this war at this stage. They're essentially kind of trying to drag out that process and not explicitly lose. And I think that's essentially what this is all about at the moment.
Yeah. Zelensky, meantime, gave an impassioned address to the UN General Assembly, demanding that Russia is punished. You know, we have seen the most serious sanctions ever administered against Russia, but it doesn't seem to be denting their ability to continue and for money to be flowing into their coffers from other sources.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we have to accept that, you know, the sanctions regime has been pretty extensive, but there have been carve-outs. Whenever countries come together in this sort of cooperative action, there's always a sort of undertone of their own national interests at play, I suppose. And so those sanctions are never going to kind of go the full way. That doesn't mean to say that they can't severely disrupt not only the military effort, but also things like resupply and production behind the scenes. What it is not is a quick fix. You know, sanctions are always a kind of long, drawn-out and an incremental attempt to solve a problem rather than a silver bullet, I would say.
Yeah. You know, what it does seem to be doing, though, is further strengthening support for Ukraine, which has enraged Putin and possibly pushed him to some of these new moves.
It's very interesting, because if you look at Russian state media, they've got to try and justify this, what they're still euphemistically calling a special military operation. And they're doing that by saying, oh, it's not just Ukraine fighting, it's basically like NATO troops in disguise almost. But if they're talking about supposed Ukrainian neo-Nazis, they're now having to essentially paint a whole load of allies as basically in league with neo-Nazis, which is as implausible as it sounds and is as hard to kind of logically argue as it sounds. So you get really kind of conflictual and nonsensical reports on Russian TV. It is very much a propaganda edifice that's teetering, I think, on the brink. If you thought about it at all, it would be clear just how unbelievable that is. But that's the line they're kind of having to push to justify what they're doing and make it seem like it's anything other than Russian military aggression.
Yeah. To your point, if they are trying to just drag this out longer because they don't want to suffer the ignominy of a terrible defeat, how do you see this ending?
I mean, I am not in the business of predicting the future, and there have been so many times already in this conflict where what I would have expected to happen based purely on the facts on the ground hasn't ended up happening. So a lot of the military decisions that are being made already, they're not purely rational military decisions, they're not strategically viable decisions. There's a lot of other stuff going on at play, like saving face, like essentially maintaining the position of the Russian regime. And you mustn't forget that when decisions are being made in the Kremlin right now, they're not purely about actual gains on the ground, they are about Putin cementing his position and essentially not having this ignominious defeat that's going to undermine him, I think, in his role. So it isn't purely an international conflict. We've got to look at those Russian domestic drivers too.
Indeed. Precious, lovely to have you on. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.